This is Alicia Rouvrant, and I'm with Milta Davis Fulford in Beaufort, North Carolina. Today's date is August 3rd, 2000, and this is my tape number 8300MF.1, and we'll be talking about exhibit ideas for the Corson Waterfowl Museum, and also a little bit about her family's history on from in Davis Ridge. Okay, I'm just adjusting the recording level here. Okay. Okay. Ms. Fulford, I thought we could start by when and where you were born and just a little bit about your family's history. I know you've got this wonderful recording I just learned about.
Well, I was born in Beaufort, and my father's family was born on the ridge, or he was born on the ridge, and they moved there. His mother and father and grandfather and grandmother moved there years after the Civil War because they were leaving the Wilmington area to get away from the Confederates that were coming in, and so they decided to move as far away as they could get so that they would not have any problem with the soldiers and that they could have their own so-called government. And so they ended up at Davis Shore or Ridge, whichever one you want to call it.
And why did they choose to come there?
I think they were just wandering. I don't even think they knew exactly where they were going, but they wanted to go someplace where they would be isolated from government and from the turmoils of the after part of the Civil War. So I don't even think they had any idea where they would end up. And it was a small group. Some of them stopped in North River and decided that they didn't want to go any further. So we have family in North River. Then the others moved to Davis Ridge, or the Ridge. And of course they were all accustomed to the water because they came from the Wilmington area. So they knew about the water, and that's the way they had always made their living, even when they were working for someone else. So it wasn't difficult for them to adjust once they got on Davis Ridge. And they were all his grandfather was a boat builder, and according to my Aunt Nanny, he had been taught to build boats, but his father was white. And he had taught him the trade and told him never to give it up. He had something that he could live by. So he taught his sons. And my father's father, who was Elijah Davis, taught his sons to use the water for a living. And of course the ridge supplied everything else that they wanted. It had fertile soil. They were able to grow whatever they wanted to eat, vegetable-wise. And they had their own hogs and their own chickens. And they survived very well. In fact, much better than some of the other folks who lived in this Beaufort area. My mother met my father because she was a teacher. And she went down to the ridge to teach during the week. They'd come and get her. And during the week she taught there. And then they'd bring her back on the weekends. So she met my father. And they married. And once they married, he moved up here. And of course she stopped teaching and her family started. The others remained on the ridge. All the older ones, the younger ones, began to move out. The sons, my grandfather had four sons and two daughters. And they moved out one at a time.
Now, why did they start to move out?
Well, they were seeking something else. Many of them were, the daughters especially, were tired of being in the area. One daughter married off the ridge, and she moved out. One of the sons, my father moved out because he and my mother married, and they moved up here. My Uncle David did the same thing. He married, and he moved up here. My Uncle Herbert married, and he moved in Beaufort. But they still used the water as their only support because that's what they knew. So they were still fishermen.
And when did they actually move out?
My father probably moved out in the 20s, early 20s.
Sounds like around the same time period.
And the others probably came out, I think the others probably moved out around the same time. however, they visited like they were going out of town. You know, they visited the ridge, and I remember when I was small, I loved to go there. One of the reasons was because I could ride on a boat. So you couldn't drive to the ridge. You had to go a certain place and then get on this boat and had, of course, they didn't have any engines. They used oars, and that was so much fun to me. I don't think it's much fun to the people who were using the oars. But we would go down at least once or twice a month to visit. And of course, the island was full of fig trees, and that's what I loved. And I could just stand under the fig trees and just eat all I wanted. And of course, they always had plenty of chickens and everything they needed. I know a lady told me one time when I first started teaching here in Carteret County, and she was talking. She came to a meeting, and she was trying to give us some idea what the islands were made of. And of course, she mentioned Davis Island and the fact that they were blacks who lived on Davis Island. And later, she told me that she knew that my people came from the island. In the meantime, she told the story about how religious they were, and that one night they saw this ship coming in, and they had been without food and were hungry, you know. And the ship, she saw this ship coming. They saw the ship coming in, and they were so excited because the ship was bringing food, and they had prayed all night and all day, and I listened carefully. And when she finished and started talking to me, I said, "Please don't tell that story anymore." She said, "Why?" I said, "That isn't true." I said, "They had everything they needed on that island. Why would they be walking around hungry praying for food?" They had gardens, they had chickens, they had hogs, they had cows, and the water was there for all the seafood. Then why would they be hungry and waiting for a ship to bring them? And some ship came in, you know, it sounded good, I guess. But I said, "It isn't true." So she said, "Well, I won't tell that anymore." I said, "Please don't. I've never known anyone on the island to go hungry." I said, "Well, when we would visit, they would overload us with food to bring back home. You know, with all the plants they had, the collards and the cabbage or whatever they had growing." So she said, "Okay, I won't tell that again." But they survived down there easily, and they were all quite happy. The older people, the younger people wanted to get out, you know, and find something different. But the old people were happy until 33. And of course, that was the huge storm that came in, and we didn't have the warnings that we have now about getting out of places like that. And so that completely destroyed the island, the homes and everybody there, and
What kind of
everything they
impact
had.
did that have on the family members that remained?
They all moved to Beaufort. Overnight, they had to come the next morning. I remember my father and my uncles getting cars together to go down to see about them because we didn't know what had happened to them. And they moved down, they went down and had to bring all of them at one time up here. No homes were left. Everything, my grandfather's house, they said, was still left. But it was so low, it had flooded completely, and everything in it had been destroyed. One house that was sitting up high, my aunt had built, she and her husband, a brand new house. And they wanted it up high, they said. Well, of course, that didn't work. They said the last time they saw it, it was going out to see the whole house. And they just walked all night long, holding hands and praying. Had a lantern in the front and one in the back, according to my grandfather. And they put the women and children in the middle, and the men at the back and front. And they just walked because they couldn't go in the homes. They were afraid that the homes might be completely destroyed. And the next morning, by the time they got down there, they were just standing around. And I could imagine, now that I'm older, how desolate that must have looked. But they brought them all up here, and immediately rooms had to be made for them to stay in. You know, I remember my grandfather stayed with us, and my grandmother stayed with my other uncle. And did both of them stay with us? I think both of them stayed with us. In the meantime, they began to look for rented homes to be rented, and they finally got them all. Within a year, they had them all placed comfortably.
Wow. But then they went to rentals after owning their own homes?
Yeah, they
That
had to
must
go
have
to
been hard.
rentals, and of course the rents had to be paid by the relatives because they didn't have any money. They had no jobs, and they couldn't do anything. I don't think my grandmother and grandfather lived very long after that. I think they were desolate.
And was this Elijah Davis?
Yeah, that was Elijah Davis and Betty Davis, Elizabeth Davis. And then the others that were brought up, they just, I think all of them died just about before I got grown. The older members.
What do you think was the significance of that community to the Down East area?
Well, they had a culture of their own. They were very religious. And according to Aunt Nanny, they didn't stay within their own island. The other islands were just like family to them. They went to religious services with one another. She said, there wasn't any segregation. Said the only thing that segregated us was the water. And we would get in our boats and go to the island to weddings. They would come to ours for dinners, reunions. So we had a going thing where we just shared things. And if we grew something over in our island that another one didn't have, why, we just transported it backward and forward and sold it or gave it to them for, traded it for something else.
You know, one thing that David Soselsky says in that book is that there seemed to be better relationships between African Americans and whites there, for instance, than there was over here. Did that hold true for your family?
That's exactly what Aunt Nanny said. I wasn't old enough to realize the relationship between the islands. But she would say, you know, and as long as Aunt Nanny lived, there were people from different islands that came to visit her and bring things, you know, especially after she got ill. And a lady called me maybe a year after she died because she didn't know she was dead, and she had been up to visit her. I said, well, she passed. And she was so upset about that, you know, because they kept in contact with her. She was the only one left that they would know, the older people would know. And they kept in contact with her. And I think the idea of segregation was far from their minds. I mean, they were segregated, like Aunt Nanny said, by the water automatically. So they didn't have to be mingling constantly. Another reason probably that there was little or no segregation was the fact that they were self-sufficient. They did not have to rely on industry or anything from another island, which none of them had to start with. They all shared about the same things. So that was probably another reason that they didn't have to worry about it.
You know, some of the watermen that I interviewed in the Chesapeake talked about race relations on the water being different than ashore. That there was a way in which sometimes white and black fishermen would help each other out on the water because they had to, whereas there might not be as much of that ashore. How does that compare to what your family has told you, your fishing
Very
family?
much so. I think I heard my daddy say that whenever they were outside the bar, all the boats would be out there together. But each one of them would be checking on the other one, you know, to see if they were all okay and if they were all going to get in on time. The night my Uncle David's boat went down and all the men died, my daddy was out there on his boat, but he said he was headed toward the bar when he saw Uncle David. And of course the other ships were all coming in because the weather was bad. And he came through the bar, he said, and he was looking at the others coming through. But he didn't ever see Uncle David's boat come through. And when he got home, it was dark. It was, well, almost dark when he got home. But 10 or 11 o'clock that night, I heard him walking. You know, I was in bed. He's walking up and down the floor, and I heard him tell, Mother said, well, what is wrong with you? He said, I haven't heard David's boat. They had to whistle for the bar to open. And he knew the whistle. And he hadn't heard it. So he didn't sleep. And when I got up the next morning to go to school, he had gone. because you didn't have the communication then that you have now. So he had to go look to find out what was going on, and he stayed and stayed, and I went to school. And when I came back from school, when this Queen Street High School, on the corner of Pine and Queen, when I got along there, the people were just like this. I think every black family in town was in that area. And I became frightened. I didn't know what had happened, but I knew something was wrong. I ran all the way home from that corner all the way home. And when I got home, they were all sitting, and my mother was crying, my aunt was crying. It was a terrible time. And when I asked what was wrong, she said David's boat went down. And she had a brother on there. And then Daddy's brother had two brothers on there. And then he had a brother-in-law on there. We had funerals all during the holidays, during the Christmas holidays. But that's how close they were. Even out on the ocean, they realized they had to rely on one another.
So other white fishermen came to help.
Came to help. Of course, there were white fishermen on his boat.
Did they save anyone on the boat?
Yeah, there were 4 people who were saved. My uncle was one of them. One of my uncles was one of them.
What year was this?
This was 40, so I graduated in 44. 43, I think it was 43. Wow. And they said 3 out of the 21 saved. And that wasn't, people would say you need to know how to swim when you're fishing, but you can't swim in those waters. When you have storms, you don't swim in those. You go where the water carries you. Because the 3 that were saved didn't know how they were saved. They were just washed up on the shore. They don't know how they got there.
And what fishing was this, the Menhaden?
Mm-hmm. These were Smith's boats.
So Smith out of,
like the Smith Museum.
Right, but also the Janice Smith, Billy Smith's operation?
No, this was,
It's not Smith.
I don't think it's that Smith. I don't remember Billy Smith. Harvey Smith.
Oh, it might have been the...
Harvey Smith was one. That was his father was the one. His father was living then, but Harvey took over after his father died.
Harvey Smith. And they were out of...
Out of
Beaufort.
Beaufort.
Yeah. Gosh, I would love to talk more about your family's history in Menhaden. Oh, there's so much to cover.
Yes.
And by the way, are all of the names of your family members on that other tape, or should we gather some of those of your great-grandparents and your parents?
They're on the tape.
Okay.
Because I looked those up and, to make sure I had names correct. So they're all on the tape.
Okay, great. Which family members worked in Menhaden that were some of the first black captains?
David Davis, Adrian Davis, that was my father, and Herbert Davis. Now years later, his son Herbert Jr. worked in there too as a captain, but that was a long time afterward. But they were the first 3.
And do you remember hearing about how your dad secured his position? You told me a little bit about that off tape. Would you like to talk about it on tape?
Oh, I don't mind. I know he felt like he was capable of becoming a captain, and he had interned long enough, and he was going to ask Smith for a boat. That's what they call it. I want a boat. And he says, I don't know what I'll get. I may even lose my job because you weren't supposed to ask him. He was supposed to come to you. But he felt like it was time. And my mother said, go for it. And he asked. And immediately he gave him the boat. No conversation after that. He took the boat.
Now, how many African-American Menhaden captains were on the water at that point?
Only one before my dad. That was his brother, David.
So David was the first one to break in. How integrated were the crews at that point?
They were well integrated because they wanted good fishermen. They didn't care what color you were if you were a good fisherman, and that's what they were after. And each captain was responsible for seeing that he had a good crew working good crew. And so they really did not care what color you were if you wanted to work on the boat, and you could and would work.
You mentioned off tape about how there weren't many black captains and the kind of risk that was for your dad to take that step. Did he talk much about what that was like to be one of the early first black captains?
He wasn't a great talker. And if he did, I didn't hear it because I didn't sit around and listen, like some kids do. I was out, but I did hear that part because I think it was done at night while we were sitting around. And that's when I began to think, that there were no captains except my Uncle David, black captains. And he and my dad had worked under him, and I don't know how long he had worked under him. But he felt like he was ready, to do his own thing. Because he moved up to mate. That's high as you go before you get to be a captain. And he felt like he could do the same thing his brother was doing. And so he asked for the position, and evidently they thought he could too. And then next came Uncle Herbert. He felt the same way. He was still under Uncle David. Well, he was still under Uncle David. He moved up to mate after my daddy left Uncle David. And then he moved up and said, well, but he didn't ask for it until after the drownings, after that boat went down. Because I thought he never would go on the water again. I could see now. But, he was right back there and ready to be a captain.
What would you say gave your father and your uncles the confidence to try to take that kind of step? And I know that's not an easy step because I've interviewed people in the Chesapeake who left the area because they couldn't break in.
Right.
What gave them that confidence, do you think? Or that
I think it was the knowledge of the fact that they knew that they had the knowledge of the water. I've heard my cousin who worked with my daddy for a while as an engineer, he worked with my father. He said my father taught him all he needed to know. He said Uncle Adrian knew everything about the water, and he could spot fish that nobody else could do. At that time, you did have to spot your own fish. You didn't have planes to do it for you.
Right.
And he said when he told you to pull in and ready to set, he knew exactly what he was talking about.
So he was one of the spotters?
He was,
Yeah.
being the captain,
Right.
he would go up in the top and spot his own fish. But they say he did that when he was the mate for under Uncle David. So that's what the captain's job was, to tell him when to let the nets down and when to pull in. And I just heard David say Uncle Adrian knew what he was doing. So he probably knew the same thing. I know how to spot fish, and I know how I can do the job. So he asked for it. And being on the water all his life, ever since he was born, he had been making his living on the water.
So you had that knowledge and then kind of the history of having been on the water. What about, did folks from Davis Ridge have a different kind of reputation here? Did it help him, for instance, that he was part of the Davis family?
I don't think so. But then I'm not sure. May have, but I really don't think it did. I think, like Smith himself, I don't think cared about color if he was getting his work done.
If the fish were being found.
That's right.
Yeah.
And he wanted the best person, or the best persons to find the fish, so I don't think he really cared who you were, as long as you did that. Now, if he had somebody equal to you that was white, I'm sure they would have had precedence. But since he didn't have that, he took the best persons he could get, because he wanted to he wanted this fish brought in, and he didn't care who brought them in.
And I guess coming from generations on the water, they would have owned their own boats previously.
Oh,
right?
yeah. That's in my interview too. They were boat builders. My grandfather was a boat builder because his grandfather was the one that told him never to lose the trade.
Was this Elijah Davis who was the boat builder? He was quite significant, wasn't he?
He was quite significant. He was.
What do you remember?
I don't remember very much about him. And it wasn't he that introduced the boat building. It was his father that did that. The little I remember about my grandfather was so pleasant, though. He was such a pleasant person, soft spoken. But those guys, I remember my dad and uncles who would get angry because one uncle was, a black sheep. You always got one. And he got into trouble, one thing right after the other. They couldn't keep him straight. And so the other uncles, my dad and Uncle David and Uncle Herbert, were always grumbling about Uncle Sutton getting into trouble, and they had to bail him out. And so one time he went down to Atlanta and got in trouble because he had married and his wife and had a daughter. And he and his wife had separated, and she was from Atlanta. She went back to Atlanta with the daughter. And of course he was determined to go down and visit them, and she didn't want to see him and told him not to come. And he went, and she had him arrested while he was there. And of course Dad and Uncle Herbert said, let him stay in jail. That'll teach him a lesson. He shouldn't have gone. Let him stay there. And my grandfather quietly said, that is your brother. Go down and see about him. And he talked just like I'm talking. I never heard him raise his voice. Papa, he does it. That's your brother. Go get him. And they all got together and went down and got him.
Family loyalty.
Family loyalty. Yeah. And he believed in that, and he taught them that. And they had gotten Uncle Sutton, even after my grandfather died, they were still getting Uncle Sutton out of one little scrape after the other. He straightened up before he died.
Another thing that David says in that article, and I've heard other historians talk about this, that for African American families that owned land, even if, for instance, with the hurricane they ended up losing that land, that had a particular effect for African Americans who grew up in that. Do you think that, or coming from a family that had land, was that true for your family? Did that change
Definitely
their experience?
It affected them, and my granddad and grandmother told my daddy not to let that land get away from them. We went to visit an aunt who lived in New York when I was maybe 10 or 12 years old, and she asked my father, have you all done anything about that land? Have you been to see about it? And he said no. She said it will go to somebody else because you all aren't interested. Dad said, well, I don't know what to do. She said, well, find somebody that does. She was, and she said, don't let them take the land from you. And of course, nobody bothered. I understand, and I never have known what happened to the land. I don't know who the land belongs to now. But I understand that some black people, nephews and nieces, and some of them were involved in the selling of the land. I don't know whether that's true or not, because I don't have any evidence of that. But I'm sure somebody had to be contacted. The land belonged to them. And somebody had to be contacted, and I don't know who it belongs to now.
I don't recall, yeah.
But anyway, it was, someone said it belonged to the government. The government had bought it in, and then someone said it belonged to somebody else, and it's just been rumors about where the land.
They should make it historic.
They should,
I think,
whoever it belongs to now. Because I told you, this lady told me that there were still graveyards there.
Yeah, and that's why I was saying I should put you in touch with Eddie McCoy about that. David has talked about there being very little reference to Davis Ridge in history books. I saw just a tiny mention of it in this Heritage of Carteret County book. I guess your daughter's written something about it. How important is it to feature the story of Davis Ridge, say, at the Corf Sound Waterfowl Museum? Is that a significant story to Down East?
Well, it certainly would be to me. I don't know how anyone else would view that, but it would certainly be of interest to me.
What parts of that story do you think are most important for people to know about locally, or even from away?
Well, I think one of the most important things is the fact that they had a skill, that they were able to survive because they were able to, when they first moved there, they had a skill. They could build boats. And they were not dependent on any outside forces. They became self-sufficient.
You know, one thing that a number of people have talked about is self-sufficiency of Downeasters, just generally.
Mm-hmm.
What kinds of qualities do you think make Downeasters unique?
They
Um,
believe what they say. They think they are self-sufficient. I had an incident with a young man when I was in teaching at East Carteret, and he was in ninth grade, but he wasn't old enough to drop out, and so he was a troublemaker. You know, he wanted to be suspended, and of course they would suspend him for a week, and then he'd come back. He said they should have let me stay the rest of the time. I said, why? Don't you want an education? He said, I don't need what I need an education for. He said, I'm gonna shrimp and I'm gonna fish. That's the way I'm gonna make my living. I said, well, how about just for yourself? He said, for what? He finished the ninth grade and then he quit. He said, my daddy is a shrimper. He's got a shrimp boat, and that's what I'm gonna do. I already know what I need to know.
was he white or black?
He was white. So I think they have that kind of uniqueness. They feel self-sufficient. And I don't know, that might be a broad statement for, maybe not today, but at one time, I know they all felt like they really didn't need the outside world.
Do you think that's true as much today?
No, I'm sure it has changed. I know that there are many who now feel like an education is absolutely necessary. One thing, the water does not make you self-sufficient any longer. You know, you don't, we have spoiled the waters to some extent and depleted the supply. So no longer can you say, you know, I can make my living doing that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's probably one of the reasons it has changed the attitude of many of them.
Mm-hmm.
Then there are those who feel like you need more than that too, today. So that's,
Do you, thinking about these qualities of Downeasters, how do you define Down East, either geographically or culturally? Does that?
geographically, I guess I would define it just as being outside of the Beaufort area. I consider anything east of Beaufort as being down east.
And what about culturally? What defines it in terms of the traditions or
I
aspects of
think
life here?
culturally, they have been bound to the water, making a living from the water, and they felt like that was sufficient culturally. I don't think that's true any longer, as I've said. But at one time, they were like a town to themselves, an area to themselves. And I know my folks felt the same way. I mean, we had problems getting them to visit up here. They wanted us to come down there. But we had a problem getting them to leave the island because why do we need to leave the island, you know? For what? What do you have to offer in Beaufort that we don't have down here? And we have more of it.
I've heard a lot of people say similar comments. Yeah,
Yeah, I think that's
across, white or
Mhm.
black, really.
true.
Yeah.
I think that's the way they feel.
Yeah.
But I think times have changed, the communication, the the fact that the water does not now give you all the things that you need or want.
Did the folks in your family circle, did they identify more strongly with Down East or with Davis Ridge in particular? Do you have a sense of that?
I probably think that it was more Davis Ridge, and then the second would be down east, and then the third would be Beaufort.
How did that change after Davis Ridge was no more as a community?
Well, once they moved up here, they died out. They were older anyway, and once they moved to Beaufort, they just died out one by one. And because of that, I think the few that were left blended in. We have one lady now, Lila Van. Lila Van is the only one, and Lila did not come from the ridge. She was on one of the other islands. Surprisingly, her father, and I can't tell you the story of that, and I'm not sure Lila can either now because her mind is not good. But she didn't come from the ridge. She was from one of the other islands, and I don't remember. It was a small group of family of blacks that came from one of the other islands. And I don't know anything about them other than that.
Interesting.
But she's not well now, so I don't think she could tell you herself.
I heard of a Miss Lou who worked in processing. Actually, I can't recall now whether she was white or black. She might have been white, actually. I was thinking if she was black. That's not the same then, no. So then Lila Van might be one of the few people.
Lila, L-E-L-A.
L-E-L-A. She might be one of the few from that time period, it sounds like.
From that time period,
living.
and from another island. See, and there's some background there. I don't know whether she can tell it to you now or not, but there's a background of her family that was different from mine, from the Davis area.
Where's the African American community centered now? The folks that, you said that members had died off over time here. What happened to that tight-knit community or communities?
Well, once they moved from the island into Beaufort, they were scattered around. See, they didn't have access to each other. I remember one part of a family that was put up on Cedar Street in a 2-story house. A distant aunt and her 2 brothers. And then there was then my grandmother and grandfather at our house. We lived right over there. And then my Uncle David had a couple in his house on Pine Street. And another group moved with a cousin on, name of that street, Live Oak Street. So they were scattered, so that the only time they really got together after they moved here was at church.
Has anyone ever done a reunion of yeah.
Not
It would
of
be
the
interesting
Davis.
to
It
get.
would be.
It would be very interesting. Yeah. Coming back to the museum, especially thinking about a reunion and the idea of kind of bringing people's stories back together, how could the museum help in sort of preserving the history and culture or maybe the legacy of Davis Ridge?
That's a hard one. A museum is something that the tapes would be good.
So maybe interviews?
Interviews
Yeah.
and tapes. I think they do that down here to this museum. And they have 1 or 2 artifacts. I think they have the Parkins's anchor. That's the boat that went down.
Is this the one your uncle
Yeah.
was running?
That anchor is still there. It was on Front Street for a while, right in front of the post office. But I think it's in this museum now. Photos would be good, but I don't know where you get them. Like I said, people just didn't take pictures like they do now. But if we could get those, I have a sister-in-law who has a few.
Great. That's
I'll check with her about that because I think she showed me 1 or 2. I'll check with Aunt Nanny's granddaughter. She's moved back in that house now that has been done up again. And she's back in that house, so she may have kept. She had a huge picture of Uncle David. I have a small one of my dad.
That would be great. Wow.
I have only 1 picture of my dad, and that's very small, but I do have that one. They may be able to get one of Uncle Herbert. His daughter and older son has died, but the younger son is living.
You said something about your daughter having interviewed other family members. Does she have an interest in trying to kind of keep the family history?
She did,
alive?
and she had an interest in getting a family reunion together. She couldn't get any help. So she put it aside. There weren't too many people ready, to do that. But she's like that. She loves to write, and she loves to put things together. And so she has done a little bit of that. She couldn't get the reunion together, so she dropped that one. But she does love to, and she was so excited about the tape that I did.
Great.
In fact, she's the one that took it and showed it to people. She works at college in New Bern.
We'll have to get a copy of this one made for you.
Yeah, I love that too. But a lot of the things that I've just told you are on the tape.
Yeah.
Mm.
What about how to represent the story of the Menhaden industry and African Americans' roles in that? How important would that be to include?
I think it would be very important. There have been many black captains since that time, but they were the first. So I think it would be very important.
So maybe more tape. You could do more taping potentially. Yeah. But there's a number of retired captains around still.
I don't know about that.
Huh.
I was thinking, how many do I know that are still living? I really don't know anybody. There may be, but in this area, I mean,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't know anybody. Because, let's see, Herbert died. That was the junior.
Hmm.
Albert Cowan was from Southport. He died.
Might take some searching
Some
around
searching,
to figure
because
that
I
out.
haven't
Yeah.
kept up with them.
Yeah.
It's probably more than that. I just
Right.
don't know them.
What other aspects of life in core sound and culture do you think should be in the museum? If there were 3 rooms, this is what I've been asking people. What traditions or aspects of the history of Down East should be there?
That's difficult. And you're thinking of east of Beaufort.
Uh-huh.
Offhand, I can't think of any. That's the major thing. And I can't think of anything. Oh, well, I think in terms of education, they thought that was so important at that time that they were willing to pay my mother to come down there and stay the whole week and then to come back. And they got her there and back every week. They thought education was important.
I've heard that from a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. So that's good, I think.
Well, speaking of education, how might the museum be able to fill that role to teach people about the areas?
Well, as I said, the tapes. I don't know how you get, people don't sit down and listen to tapes very often unless it's something else around. But if you could get a video tape, and I think they do that in the museum down here. They have, and they used to have a speaker that would come in ever so often.
So maybe some presentations that talked about,
Mhm.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then it sounded like you're saying some sort of video, audio. Some
Mhm.
people can do, sometimes you can do like an audio tape loop, where you have excerpts of interviews like on this, where people are telling stories and then they get strung together. You could do something
Yeah.
that.
They had one guy down at Garland Fulford that told about the fishing. He had been a fisherman, and he loved to talk, and he was a good presenter. So he was down there, especially on special occasions. They'd have him down there to present things that you do with fish and how you fished, and then he was a great singer and he sang. But he died, and so I don't know whether they have those tapes or not.
Was that, where did he make his presentation?
Down here to the Beaufort Museum.
It was at the museum, yeah. What about the presentation that you did? Tell me a little bit about that, unless that's on the other tape. you were asked to make a presentation for that.
Yeah, I was asked by the Beaufort Historical Society, and that was during Black History Month. And at the end of the month, I made the presentation on the Davis family,
Nice.
Sutton Davis family.
And that was part of Black History Month?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think, I don't know, I mean, I don't know what the museum's plans are, but having someone like you speak about that from a first person place is I think a valuable one. Is that something you're willing to do or interested in doing?
Yes, I
Yeah.
wouldn't mind doing it since I have done